The morning mist hung heavy over Windshire Castle as Princess Elena stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass while her mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard the night before. The hushed voices of her parents, King Edmund and Queen Victoria, had carried through the corridors like whispers of doom. Elena had always known that being born into royalty came with responsibilities, but at 26, she was beginning to understand the true weight of the crown that would one day rest upon her head. The Kingdom of Astoria had been her family's legacy for over 3 centuries, and now it faced its greatest challenge yet. The economic crisis that had gripped neighboring nations was slowly creeping toward their borders. Trade routes that had once brought prosperity were becoming unreliable, and the common people were beginning to question whether the monarchy was truly serving their best interests. Elena could see it in their eyes during public appearances, the growing distance, the polite but hollow applause, the way conversations seemed to halt when she approached. Her younger brother, Prince Marcus, knocked softly on her door before entering. At 23, he possessed a carefree spirit that Elena sometimes envied. His military training had given him a different perspective on leadership, one that seemed less burdened by the ceremonial aspects of royal duty. "You missed breakfast again," Marcus said, settling into the chair by her fireplace. "Mother is concerned you're not eating enough." Elena turned from the window, offering her brother a weary smile. "I've been thinking about Father's announcement yesterday. The council meeting didn't go well, did it?" Marcus's expression grew serious. The jovial mask he typically wore in public seemed to slip away, revealing the depth of his own concerns. "The Prime Minister believes we need to modernize quickly if we want to maintain relevance. Some of the older council members are resistant to change, but the younger generation of politicians is pushing for significant reforms." "What kind of reforms?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Constitutional monarchy with severely limited powers. Essentially, we would become figureheads with no real political influence." "The alternative?" Marcus paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The alternative is abolishment altogether." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had been preparing her entire life to serve as queen, to be the bridge between the crown and the people. The thought that such a role might simply cease to exist felt like watching her entire identity crumble. Their father had spent 42 years on the throne, dedicating his life to serving Astoria with dignity and wisdom. Their grandfather before him had modernized the kingdom's infrastructure and education systems. The royal family had always evolved with the times, but this felt different. This felt like an ending rather than an adaptation. Elena walked to her desk, where correspondence from various charitable organizations awaited her attention. Over the years, she had championed causes related to education, healthcare, and environmental conservation. These weren't just ceremonial roles for her. They were genuine passions that allowed her to make meaningful contributions to society. "Do you think we've become irrelevant, Marcus?" she asked, sorting through letters from children in the rural provinces who had benefited from the literacy programs she had established. "I think we've become misunderstood," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "People see the palace, the ceremonies, the expensive events, and they don't understand the work that happens behind the scenes. They don't see you staying up until midnight reviewing proposals for new schools, or father meeting with foreign dignitaries to secure better trade agreements for our farmers." Elena nodded, but she could feel doubt creeping into her thoughts. Perhaps the criticism was valid. Perhaps in their efforts to maintain tradition, they had lost touch with the rapidly changing needs of their people. The world was moving at an unprecedented pace, and institutions that had once provided stability were increasingly viewed as obstacles to progress. A soft knock interrupted her contemplation. Her personal secretary, Mrs. Thompson, entered with an urgent expression on her weathered face. She had served the royal family for over 2 decades and had never appeared quite so troubled. "Your Highness, I'm afraid there's been a development. The morning newspapers have published results from a recent poll regarding the monarchy's future. I thought you should see them before your parents do." Elena's heart sank as she accepted the newspapers. The headlines were stark and unforgiving. Majority of citizens favor republic over monarchy. Royal family's approval rating reaches historic low. Is this the end of the crown? As she read through the articles, Elena felt a profound sadness settling over her. The poll numbers were devastating. 63% of citizens now favored abolishing the monarchy entirely. Among those under 30, the percentage rose to 78%. Comments from citizens ranged from respectful suggestions for reform to harsh criticism of what they perceived as an outdated and expensive institution. Marcus read over her shoulder, his face growing pale. These numbers, they're much worse than we thought. Elena set the newspapers aside and walked back to the window. The gardeners were still working among the roses, their movement steady and purposeful. She wondered if they too harbored resentment toward the family they served, or if they simply saw their work as another job in an uncertain economy. "We need to talk to Father," she said finally. "If these numbers are accurate, we're facing something unprecedented in our family's history." The weight of centuries seemed to press down upon Elena's shoulders. She thought of the portraits lining the castle's corridors, generations of kings and queens who had faced wars, famines, and political upheavals, but who had never questioned the fundamental legitimacy of their role. She was part of a lineage that stretched back through triumph and tragedy, and now she might be witnessing its final chapter. As she prepared to seek out her parents, Elena realized that the conversation ahead would determine not just her own future, but the fate of an institution that had shaped their nation's identity for centuries. The morning that had begun with simple contemplation was about to become a turning point in the history of Astoria. The castle's ancient stones had witnessed many moments of crisis, but perhaps none quite like this, a quiet, peaceful revolution of public opinion that threatened to accomplish what no army had ever managed, the peaceful dissolution of the crown itself. King Edmund sat behind the massive oak desk in his private study, the same desk where his father and grandfather had made decisions that shaped the kingdom for decades. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across documents that would determine the monarchy's fate. His weathered hands, which had signed countless treaties and royal decrees, now trembled slightly as he reviewed the polling data his advisors had compiled overnight. Queen Victoria entered quietly, carrying a tea service that clinked softly against the silence. Her elegant composure, refined through decades of public service, couldn't quite mask the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes. She had been Edmund's partner not just in marriage, but in every aspect of royal duty, and together they had navigated crises that had tested their resolve and strengthened their commitment to their people. "The children are coming," Victoria said softly, settling into the chair across from her husband. Elena looked devastated when Mrs. Thompson showed her the newspapers. "Marcus is trying to maintain his optimism, but I can see the concern in his eyes." Edmund nodded, setting aside a particularly troubling report from the constitutional law experts. The legal pathways for dissolving the monarchy were surprisingly straightforward. A simple referendum followed by parliamentary action could effectively end centuries of royal tradition within a matter of months. The mechanism had always existed, but no one had seriously considered that it might actually be used. 42 years, Victoria, Edmund said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. 42 years of service, of trying to modernize while preserving tradition, of adapting to every change our society has demanded. And now they're telling us that none of it matters. Victoria reached across the desk to place her hand over his. Their wedding rings, simple gold bands worn smooth by time, caught the light. They had married for love in an era when royal marriages were still largely political arrangements, and their partnership had become a model for modern monarchy, accessible, genuine, and deeply committed to public service. "Perhaps we're looking at this the wrong way," Victoria suggested gently. "Maybe this isn't about failure. Maybe it's about success. We've helped create a society that no longer needs traditional monarchy. Our people are educated, prosperous, and capable of self-governance. Isn't that what we've always worked toward?" Before Edmund could respond, Elena and Marcus entered the study. Elena had composed herself since reading the morning papers, but her usual poise seemed fragile, like glass that might shatter at the slightest pressure. Marcus, despite his attempt to appear strong for his sister, carried himself with the bearing of a soldier who had received devastating news from the battlefield. "Father, we need to discuss what happens next," Elena said, taking a seat beside her mother. "These poll numbers, they're not just statistics. They represent a fundamental shift in how our people view the monarchy. We can't ignore them or hope they'll improve without significant changes." Edmund studied his daughter's face, seeing in her features the same determination that had driven him to modernize the kingdom's approach to environmental protection and social welfare. Elena had inherited the best qualities of both her parents, Victoria's emotional intelligence and his own analytical mind, but She had also developed a progressive worldview that sometimes put her at odds with traditional royal protocol. "I've been thinking about this all night," Edmund replied. "There are essentially three paths before us. We can fight to maintain the status quo, hoping that public opinion will shift back in our favor. We can negotiate a reduced role, becoming a purely ceremonial institution with no political power. Or we can step aside voluntarily." Marcus finished, his military training having taught him to confront difficult truths directly. "We can dissolve the monarchy on our own terms, rather than having it forced upon us." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the family had believed about their purpose and identity. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock that had measured time in the study for over 2 centuries. Each tick seemed to count down toward a decision that would reshape not just their personal lives, but the entire political structure of Astoria. Victoria was the first to break the silence. "If we choose the third option, what happens to all the work we've accomplished? The charitable foundations, the international partnerships, the ceremonial traditions that still bring comfort to many of our citizens. Those things don't have to end with the monarchy," Elena said thoughtfully. "Many former royal families have continued their charitable work as private citizens. We could establish foundations, maintain our international connections, and continue serving our people in different capacities." Edmund reached for a folder containing correspondence from constitutional experts and political analysts. Over the past several days, he had quietly consulted with trusted advisors about the practical implications of various scenarios. The picture that emerged was complex, but not entirely bleak. "The Prime Minister has suggested a transition period," Edmund explained. "If we were to voluntarily abdicate, Parliament would establish a temporary government structure while a new constitution is developed. Our personal properties would remain ours, but the state assets, the castles, the crown jewels, the formal regalia, would be transferred to the people for historical preservation." "What about staff?" Marcus asked, thinking of the hundreds of people whose livelihoods depended on the royal household. "Mrs. Thompson has worked for us for 20 years. The groundskeepers, the security personnel, the administrative staff, they're not just employees, they're family." This consideration weighed heavily on Edmund's mind. The royal household employed over 400 people, many of whom had dedicated their entire careers to serving the crown. A sudden dissolution of the monarchy would leave them scrambling for new positions in an already competitive job market. "I've spoken with the Prime Minister about this as well," Edmund said. "The government would be obligated to provide transition assistance and job placement services for all royal employees. Many could be absorbed into other government departments, particularly those with experience in event management, security, and public relations." Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where she had played as a child, where she had learned about responsibility and service, where she had dreamed of the day she would carry on her family's legacy. The irony wasn't lost on her that the education and values her parents had instilled in her were now leading her to question whether that legacy should continue. "There's something else we need to consider," she said, turning back to her family. "The referendum that everyone is talking about. It's not just about whether people want to keep the monarchy. It's about what kind of society they want to create going forward. If we fight to preserve an institution that the majority no longer supports, aren't we essentially saying that tradition matters more than democracy?" This perspective struck at the heart of the family's dilemma. They had always portrayed themselves as servants of the people, but now the people were clearly indicating that they no longer desired such service. To resist would contradict the very principles of democratic governance that the modern monarchy had claimed to embody. Victoria reached for a photo on Edmund's desk, a family portrait taken just 5 years earlier during the celebration of Edmund's 40th year on the throne. The image captured a moment of genuine happiness and pride, but it now felt like a relic from a different era. "I keep thinking about your grandfather," she said to Elena and Marcus. "He always said that the monarchy's strength came from its ability to evolve. When social attitudes changed, we changed. When political structures modernized, we modernized. Maybe this is simply the next step in that evolution. The realization that evolution sometimes means transformation into something completely different." The conversation continued for hours, with each family member exploring their feelings about duty, legacy, and the meaning of service. They discussed practical matters like financial security and personal safety, but also deeper questions about identity and purpose. For people who had been defined by their roles since birth, the prospect of choosing who to become as private citizens was both terrifying and oddly liberating. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Edmund realized that they were not just discussing the end of their reign, but the beginning of a new chapter in their nation's history. The decision they made would reflect not just their personal desires, but their understanding of what true leadership meant in a changing world. The weight of centuries pressed upon them, but so did the promise of an uncertain but potentially brighter future. The Great Hall of Parliament buzzed with an energy that Elena had never experienced before. She sat in the visitors' gallery alongside Marcus, watching as representatives from across Astoria engaged in the most significant constitutional debate in their nation's history. Below them, the elected officials who would determine their family's fate spoke with passion about democracy, tradition, and the future of their country. Prime Minister Harrison, a woman in her 50s who had maintained a respectful working relationship with the royal family for nearly a decade, stood at the central podium addressing the assembly. Her words carried weight not just because of her political position, but because she had become the voice of a generation that viewed the monarchy through a fundamentally different lens than their predecessors. The question before us today is not whether King Edmund and his family are good people, Harrison declared, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. By all accounts, they have served with dignity and dedication. The question is whether an hereditary institution, regardless of the character of its occupants, has a place in a modern democracy. Elena listened intently as speaker after speaker took the floor. Some defended the monarchy with passionate arguments about stability, tradition, and the value of having a politically neutral head of state. Others argued equally passionately that hereditary privilege had no place in an egalitarian society, that the resources devoted to maintaining royal institutions could be better used for education, healthcare, and infrastructure. What struck Elena most profoundly was the thoughtfulness of the debate. These weren't angry revolutionaries seeking to tear down the establishment out of spite. These were elected representatives grappling seriously with fundamental questions about governance, representation, and the kind of society they wanted to create for future generations. Representative Sarah Chun, a young woman barely older than Elena herself, offered a perspective that resonated deeply with the princess. I respect the royal family's service, but I cannot explain to my constituents why we maintain a system where birth determines political status. How do I tell the brilliant young people in my district that their highest aspiration should be to serve someone who holds position purely through genetic lottery? The words stung, but Elena recognized their validity. She had been born into opportunity and responsibility that others could never access, regardless of their capabilities or dedication. Her education at the finest universities, her access to world leaders, her platform for advocacy. All of these advantages existed not because of anything she had earned, but simply because of the family into which she had been born. During a recess, Elena and Marcus made their way to a quiet cafe near Parliament where they could process what they had witnessed. The late autumn air carried a crispness that seemed to mirror the clarity of the political moment they were living through. "Did you hear what Representative Martinez said about the cost analysis?" Marcus asked, stirring his coffee absently. Maintaining the monarchy cost the equivalent of building 12 new schools every year, or funding healthcare for nearly 50,000 citizens. Elena nodded grimly. She had seen the numbers before, but hearing them presented in that context made them feel different. The castle maintenance, security details, ceremonial events, and administrative costs added up to a staggering sum that could indeed be redirected towards services that would directly improve people's daily lives. But what about tourism? Elena asked, echoing one of the arguments they had heard from monarchy supporters. The heritage sites, the ceremonial attractions, don't they bring economic benefits? Representative Johnson had an interesting response to that, Marcus replied. She pointed out that France receives more royal tourism than any country with an active monarchy. People visit Versailles by the millions, but France hasn't had a king or queen for over 2 centuries. Historic preservation doesn't require active monarchy. As they sat in contemplative silence, Elena noticed a young family at a nearby table. The parents were helping their small daughter with homework, patiently explaining math concepts, and encouraging her efforts. The scene was ordinary, but it struck Elena as profound. These were citizens of Astoria living their lives, pursuing their dreams, raising their children to believe in merit and hard work, without any need for royal guidance or inspiration. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Margaret Foster, a constitutional law professor who had served as an informal advisor to the royal family during this crisis. Her expertise had been invaluable in helping them understand the legal implications of various scenarios, but her presence today suggested new developments. "I wanted to speak with you both before the afternoon session begins," Dr. Foster said, settling into a chair at their table. "There have been some interesting developments in the polling data and focus group discussions that the Parliamentary Committee commissioned." Elena leaned forward with interest. Understanding public opinion had become crucial for making informed decisions about their family's future. "The numbers are more nuanced than the initial headlines suggested," Dr. Foster continued. "While a majority does favor ending the monarchy, there's significant variation in how people envision that transition. About 30% want immediate abolition with minimal transition period. Another 33% prefer a gradual transition over several years. But, interestingly, 27% would support maintaining a very limited ceremonial role if it came with substantial democratic reforms." "What kind of reforms?" Marcus asked. "Constitutional amendments that would require all royal positions to be confirmed by Parliament, term limits on royal service, elimination of hereditary succession in favor of democratic selection, and complete transparency in royal finances. Essentially, it would transform the monarchy into an elected ceremonial presidency with royal titles." Elena considered this possibility. It would preserve some elements of tradition while addressing the democratic concerns that seemed to drive public opposition. But it would also fundamentally change what it meant to be royal, transforming their family from hereditary rulers into something more like elected public servants with ceremonial duties. "There's something else," Dr. Foster added. The focus groups revealed interesting generational differences in what people value about the monarchy. Older citizens often mention stability, continuity, and international prestige. Younger citizens, when they expressed any positive views at all, focused almost exclusively on charitable work and advocacy for social causes. This information provided Elena with new insight into how her own work was perceived. The educational initiatives, environmental programs, and healthcare advocacy that she had poured her heart into were indeed valued by some citizens, but primarily as charitable activities rather than as legitimate governmental functions. As they prepared to return for the afternoon session, Elena felt a growing sense of clarity about the path forward. The parliamentary debate was revealing not just public opinion, but the deep philosophical questions that their family needed to answer for themselves. The afternoon session focused on the mechanics of constitutional change and the practical implications of various transition scenarios. Elena listened as experts outlined timelines, legal procedures, and precedents from other countries that had transitioned away from monarchy in recent decades. What emerged was a picture of complexity that went far beyond simple abolition. The monarchy was woven into hundreds of laws, international treaties, and institutional structures. Untangling those connections would require careful planning and significant time, regardless of which path the nation chose. As the day's proceedings concluded, Elena realized that the debate had shifted something fundamental in her own thinking. She was no longer asking whether the monarchy should continue, but rather how it should end. The question had become not whether to preserve her family's role, but how to conclude it in a way that honored both their service and the democratic principles that their people clearly valued. Walking back through the streets of the capital with Marcus, Elena noticed details she had somehow missed during previous visits. The shop owners preparing for the evening rush, the students heading home from university, the elderly couples enjoying afternoon walks. These were the people whose opinions would determine her family's fate, and, for the first time, she felt truly ready to accept whatever decision they made. The weight of centuries was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like responsibility, not just to preserve tradition, but to ensure that their family's final chapter in the story of Astoria would be written with dignity and wisdom. The royal family gathered in the castle's private dining room for what might be their final meal together as monarchs. The formal dining hall with its grand chandeliers and ancestral portraits seemed too imposing for the intimate conversation that lay ahead. Instead, they chose the smaller room where they had shared countless family dinners over the years, where the children had done homework at the antique table, where they had celebrated birthdays and anniversaries away from the public eye. Cook Mrs. Brennan had prepared a simple meal, sensing perhaps that elaborate formality would be inappropriate for such a momentous evening. The shepherd's pie and fresh bread represented comfort rather than ceremony, grounding the family in domestic normalcy as they prepared to make a decision that would reshape their nation's future. King Edmund had spent the afternoon in private consultation with his most trusted advisors, constitutional experts, and foreign diplomats. The calls to fellow monarchs in neighboring countries had been particularly enlightening, as several had faced similar challenges in recent years. The King of Valdyria had shared insights from his own experience with constitutional reforms, while the Queen of Moravia had offered perspective on maintaining dignity during times of dramatic political change. I spoke with Archbishop Williams this afternoon. Edmund began as they settled into their meal. He reminded me of something I hadn't considered, our coronation oaths. When I was crowned, I swore to serve the people of Astoria according to their will and their laws. If their will is now to govern themselves without monarchy, then honoring that oath might require stepping aside. This perspective reframed the entire discussion. Rather than viewing abdication as failure or surrender, it could be seen as the ultimate act of service, putting the people's expressed desires above personal or institutional interests. Elena had spent her day differently, visiting some of the charitable organizations she had supported over the years. The conversations with teachers, healthcare workers, and community organizers had provided grounding in the practical impact of royal advocacy. While these visits had reinforced her commitment to service, they had also highlighted how much meaningful work could be accomplished without royal titles. The director of the Literacy Foundation made an interesting point today, Elena shared. She said that my support had been valuable not because I was a princess, but because I understood the issues and could articulate solutions. The royal platform amplified the work, but it didn't create the ideas or the passion behind them. Marcus had taken a different approach, spending time with military colleagues and security personnel who had protected the royal family for years. Their perspectives had been particularly valuable because they understood both the ceremonial importance of monarchy and the practical realities of modern governance. Colonel Davies told me something that really stuck with me, Marcus said. He said that the best leaders know when to step aside for the good of their people. He compared it to military strategy. Sometimes tactical withdrawal is the most courageous choice, especially when it preserves what matters most for future generations. Queen Victoria had used her day to reflect on correspondence from citizens across Astoria. Over the years, she had maintained personal connections with people from all walks of life, and their letters had provided insight into how ordinary families viewed the monarchy's role in their daily lives. What struck me most was how many letters focused on worry for our welfare, Victoria said. People aren't angry with us personally. They're concerned about us as individuals while questioning the institution. Several writers specifically mentioned hoping that we would find happiness and fulfillment in whatever path we chose. As the evening progressed, each family member shared their thoughts about identity, purpose, and the meaning of service. Elena spoke about her desire to continue advocacy work, but in a way that empowered others rather than reinforcing hierarchical structures. Marcus discussed his interest in democratic leadership and potentially pursuing elected office in the future. Victoria reflected on the charitable foundations she had established and how they could evolve to serve even more people without royal constraints. Edmund listened to his family's perspectives while grappling with his own complex emotions. The throne had been his life's work, but he was beginning to understand that successful leadership sometimes required recognizing when that work was complete. "There's something I need to tell you all," Edmund said as dessert was served. Prime Minister Harrison called this afternoon with the results of today's emergency polling. Support for the monarchy has dropped another 8 percentage points since the parliamentary debate began. We're now looking at nearly 70% of citizens favoring abolition. The numbers hit like a physical blow, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. The decision was being made for them by the very people they had sworn to serve. But there's more, Edmund continued. The polling also asked about transition preferences. An overwhelming majority, 84%, expressed that they would want any transition to be handled with dignity and respect for our family. People want change, but they want it accomplished gracefully. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. Instead, she felt moved by the realization that their people cared enough about them as individuals to want their transition handled humanely. It suggested that the bond between royal family and citizens wasn't entirely broken, even if the formal structure needed to change. "I think we need to make the decision tonight," Marcus said quietly. "Not because we're being forced to, but because it's the right thing to do. The country needs certainty, and we need to control our own narrative rather than having it controlled for us." Victoria reached across the table to take Edmund's hand. After 40 years of marriage and decades of shared service, their connection had deepened beyond words. She could see in his eyes that he had reached the same conclusion, even though voicing it would be one of the most difficult things he had ever done. If we announce our intention to abdicate voluntarily, we can work with Parliament to design a transition that preserves dignity while respecting democratic will, Victoria said. We can ensure that our staff are cared for, that the charitable foundations continue their work, and that the monarchy ends on our terms rather than through political pressure. Elena looked around the table at the three people who had shaped her understanding of duty, service, and love. The decision they were contemplating would change everything about their lives, but it would also free them to discover who they could become when not constrained by centuries of tradition and expectation. There's one more thing to consider, Elena said. If we make this choice willingly, we set a precedent for peaceful, democratic transition. Other monarchies facing similar pressures could look to Astoria as an example of how to honor both tradition and democratic evolution. Edmund nodded slowly. The idea of their decision serving as a model for others gave additional meaning to what might otherwise feel like personal defeat. Instead of being remembered as the king who lost his throne, he could be remembered as the king who chose democracy over dynasty. As the family continued their conversation late into the evening, they found themselves planning not just an abdication, but a celebration. They would honor their service while embracing the future, demonstrating that true nobility came not from titles or crowns, but from the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. The decision had been made, though not yet announced. Tomorrow would bring conversations with Parliament, negotiations over transition details, and the beginning of the most significant constitutional change in Astoria's history. But tonight, they were simply a family who had chosen love for their people over love for power, service over tradition, and hope over fear. The weight of centuries was lifting, replaced by the lightness of possibility and the deep satisfaction that comes from making decisions with both heart and mind. The morning of the announcement dawned clear and crisp, with golden sunlight streaming through the ancient windows of Windshire Castle. Elena stood once again at her bedroom window, but this time her view was filled not with uncertainty, but with a profound sense of peace. Today, her family would announce their decision to the world, and tomorrow, the long process of democratic transition would begin. The speech had been crafted carefully over several sleepless nights, with input from constitutional scholars, political advisors, and family friends who understood both the gravity and the hope inherent in their decision. Unlike royal proclamations of the past, this address would be delivered not from the throne room, but from the castle's garden, surrounded by the roses that Elena's grandmother had planted decades ago. King Edmund spent the early morning hours walking through the castle corridors, pausing at portraits of ancestors who had never faced such a decision. Each painting told a story of service during different eras, times of war and peace, prosperity and hardship, social change and political upheaval. Today, he would add his own chapter to that story, one that he hoped would be remembered not as an ending, but as an act of ultimate service. Queen Victoria was in her private office, making final arrangements for the charitable foundations that bore the royal family's patronage. Rather than dissolving these organizations, they would be restructured to continue their work under new leadership, ensuring that the educational programs, healthcare initiatives, and environmental projects could thrive independent of royal support. Marcus had risen before dawn to meet with security personnel and household staff, personally thanking each person who had served the royal family over the years. Many had become like extended family, and ensuring their well-being during the transition had become a personal mission for the young prince. At precisely noon, the family gathered in the garden where a simple podium had been arranged among the roses. No throne, no crown, no elaborate ceremony. Just four people who had chosen to address their nation with honesty and humility. Representatives from major news networks had assembled, along with government officials and a small group of citizens who had been invited to witness this historic moment. Elena felt surprisingly calm as she stood beside her parents and brother. The decision that had seemed so overwhelming just days earlier now felt natural, even inevitable. She thought of all the young people she had met during her charitable work, bright minds who would now grow up in a country where their highest aspirations wouldn't be limited by hereditary privilege. King Edmund stepped forward to begin the address that would forever change Astoria's political landscape. His voice was steady, carrying the authority developed over 4 decades of public speaking, but also a warmth that reflected genuine care for the people he had served. "My fellow citizens," he began, "I speak to you today not as your king, but as your neighbor. After deep reflection and extensive consultation, Queen Victoria, Princess Elena, Prince Marcus, and I have made a decision that we believe serves the best interests of our nation and honors the democratic principles that define modern Astoria. The gathered crowd listened in respectful silence as Edmund explained their reasoning. He spoke of the polling data that revealed changing public attitudes, the parliamentary debates that had demonstrated the depth of democratic sentiment, and the family's own evolution in understanding what true service meant in the 21st century. We have decided to voluntarily relinquish our royal titles and dissolve the monarchy, Edmund announced. This decision comes not from political pressure or personal disappointment, but from our deep conviction that Astoria's future lies in the hands of its people, governed by representatives they choose rather than rulers they inherit. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it was not the angry roar or celebratory cheers that might have been expected. Instead, it was the sound of people processing a historic moment, recognizing both its significance and its dignity. Princess Elena stepped forward for her portion of the address. Her words focused on the future rather than the past, speaking about the opportunities that democratic transition would create for all citizens of Astoria. This decision allows our nation to fulfill its democratic potential, Elena said. It ensures that leadership positions will be earned through merit and public service, not inherited through birth. Most importantly, it demonstrates that even ancient institutions can evolve when evolution serves the common good. She spoke about the charitable foundations that would continue their work, the international partnerships that would be maintained through democratic channels, and the ceremonial traditions that could be preserved as cultural heritage rather than political necessity. Prince Marcus addressed the practical aspects of the transition. Parliament would establish a constitutional convention to draft new governing documents, ensuring that the change from monarchy to republic would be orderly and legally sound. The royal family would work closely with government officials to transfer state properties and assets to public ownership, while maintaining their private residences and personal belongings. We want to be clear that this is not a retreat or a defeat, Marcus emphasized. This is an advance toward a more perfect democracy. We are not abandoning our service to Astoria. We are transforming it into a form that better reflects our nation's values and aspirations. Queen Victoria concluded the family's remarks with words that captured the emotional heart of their decision. Her voice carried the weight of decades spent in public service, but also the hope that came from embracing uncertainty with grace. Change is never easy, especially when it involves letting go of traditions that have provided meaning and structure for generations, Victoria said. But we have learned that the highest form of love, whether for family or for country, sometimes requires the courage to let go. We trust in the wisdom of our people to create a future that honors our shared history while building something new and better. She spoke about the personal growth that the family had experienced during this process, how confronting the possibility of losing their roles had helped them discover aspects of themselves that existed independent of royal titles. As the formal remarks concluded, something unexpected happened. A child from the invited crowd of citizens approached the podium with a bouquet of flowers picked from her family's garden. She was perhaps 8 years old, with pigtails and a shy smile, representing the generation that would grow up in democratic Astoria. Elena knelt down to accept the flowers, and the little girl whispered something that only the former princess could hear. Later, Elena would share those words with her family. "Thank you for giving us the chance to be anything we want to be." The crowd began to disperse quietly, with none of the chaos or celebration that might have been expected after such a momentous announcement. Instead, there was a sense of thoughtful dignity, as if the nation itself was processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the days that followed, international reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Democratic leaders praised the royal family's courage in choosing principle over privilege, while constitutional scholars hailed the Astorian transition as a model for peaceful political evolution. More importantly for the family, domestic reaction reflected the wisdom of their decision. Polling showed that while citizens had favored ending the monarchy, they also respected the manner in which it was being concluded. Support for the transition process reached 92%, with citizens expressing pride in how their former royal family had handled this historic change. A year later, Elena would be working as director of an international education foundation. Marcus would be completing his first term as an elected member of parliament, and their parents would be traveling the world as advocates for democratic transition and constitutional reform. The castle would become a museum and cultural center, preserving Asturia's royal heritage while serving new purposes that benefited all citizens. Their quiet goodbye had indeed left the world in tears, not tears of sadness for what was ending, but tears of hope for what was beginning. The royal family of Astoria had discovered that the greatest act of nobility was choosing to make nobility itself unnecessary, transforming their love for tradition into love for progress, their dedication to service into service to democracy itself. The weight of centuries had been lifted, but the values that mattered, service, dignity, love for country, and fellow citizens, remained as strong as ever, simply expressed in new forms that honored both the past and the future.